The Nexus Military Academy sprawled across 3 moons like some cosmic joke about overachievement. Built by the Galactic Defense Coalition during a particularly optimistic phase of interspecies cooperation, it resembled what might happen if a committee of engineers from 6 different evolutionary paths tried to design the perfect training facility while arguing about gravity preferences. The result was magnificent, terrifying, and absolutely nobody's first choice for architecture. Instructor Hextaris clicked his mandibles in what passed for satisfaction among his kind. The Catherian had spent the better part of 2 centuries perfecting the art of breaking supposedly elite cadets, and today promised to be particularly entertaining. His compound eyes swept across the morning formation, cataloging weaknesses with the enthusiasm of a collector examining rare specimens. The Academy attracted the cream of military talent from across known space. Crystalline Boreans who could shatter steel with focused resonance. Aquatic Nereids whose fluid combat forms made water itself seem clumsy. Avian Skyborn who treated 3-dimensional warfare like a casual afternoon flight. Each species sent their finest, their most promising, their absolute best. And then there was the human. Elena stood at attention in the 3rd rank, her posture textbook perfect in that peculiarly human way that somehow managed to look both relaxed and ready for violence. She was unremarkable by human standards. Average height, brown hair pulled back in regulation style, the sort of person who might blend into any crowd on Earth. Here, surrounded by beings who could breathe methane or photosynthesize starlight, she stood out like a particularly stubborn weed in a garden of exotic orchids. Hextaris had studied the human file extensively. Homo sapiens, Class 3 civilization, recent additions to the coalition after their spectacularly messy first contact involving something called nuclear weapons and a very unfortunate misunderstanding about territorial displays. The species showed promise in certain areas, certainly, but they lacked the specialized advantages that made other species truly formidable. No natural armor, no energy manipulation, no enhanced strength or speed beyond their baseline biology. What they had, according to the reports, was persistence and an alarming tendency to treat impossible situations as personal challenges. The morning air carried the scent of ozone from the practice ranges and something vaguely floral from the botanical combat gardens. Around the main courtyard, other formations were conducting their own exercises. Senior cadets moved through advanced maneuvers that would have impressed military observers from any world. The precision was beautiful, the coordination flawless, the execution worthy of beings bred for warfare across 1,000 generations. Cadet Boren, a crystalline whose body structure made him look like a living geometric theorem, commanded the first-year formation with natural authority. His species had been warriors before they developed spaceflight. Their entire culture built around concepts of martial honor that translated beautifully to coalition military doctrine. Beside him, Nexia demonstrated the fluid grace that made her amphibian people such devastating close combat specialists. These were the sort of cadets the Academy was designed for. Beings whose ancestors had been perfecting the art of war while humans were still figuring out agriculture. And then there was Elena, who had somehow passed the entrance examinations despite being, by every measurable standard, physically inferior to her classmates. Her reaction times were adequate. Her strength was sufficient. Her endurance was, according to the files, surprisingly good for such a primitive species. Hextaris had plans for that endurance. The instructor's mandibles clicked again, this time in anticipation. Public humiliation was an art form among his people, and he had been looking forward to this particular performance since the humans' arrival 6 months ago. Not out of malice, exactly, but from a sense of cosmic justice. The galaxy was filled with beings who had earned their place through millions of years of evolution, genetic engineering, or technological enhancement. Humans had simply stumbled into the club through what could charitably be called luck, and what more accurately resembled a series of coincidentally favorable accidents. It was time to demonstrate the natural order of things. The morning formation protocol was simple enough. Basic conditioning exercises, combat stance drills, endurance testing, and formation coordination. Nothing that should challenge a properly trained cadet from any respectable species. The crystallines would resonate in perfect harmony. The nereids would flow like liquid music. The skyborn would move with aerial precision even while grounded, and the human would struggle, falter, and ultimately demonstrate why her species needed to understand their limitations. What Hextares had not anticipated, as he prepared to call the formation to attention, was the small cluster of younger cadets who had positioned themselves where they could observe the morning drill. The Cubs, as they were informally known, represented the next generation of coalition military talent. Pip, barely old enough for basic training, watched everything with the intense curiosity that characterized her mammalian species. Bex coiled and uncoiled his tail in nervous excitement, while Ori's gill slits fluttered with anticipation. They had heard stories about the human cadet, wild tales of impossible endurance, of stubborn refusal to acknowledge defeat, of treating pain as merely another form of data to be processed and overcome. Most of the older cadets dismissed such stories as propaganda or exaggeration. The Cubs, however, had not yet learned the proper limits of possibility. The formation snapped to attention with the sort of synchronized precision that would have made a choreographer weep with envy. 6 different species, each moving according to their own evolutionary imperatives, somehow managed to achieve perfect unity through months of grueling practice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and Instructor Hextares felt that familiar surge of satisfaction that came with absolute authority over beings who could probably level a city block if properly motivated. "Morning conditioning protocol," Hextares announced, his voice carrying the particular tone that military instructors across the galaxy seemed to develop naturally. "Standard endurance sequence, followed by combat stance integration. Senior cadets will demonstrate proper form." The announcement itself was routine. What made it interesting was the way Hextares's compound eyes fixed on Elena with the focused intensity of a predator selecting its prey. The human maintained her regulation posture, but something in her stance suggested she knew exactly what was coming. Humans, apparently, had evolved excellent pattern recognition, along with their other modest survival traits. "Cadet Elena," Hextares called, his mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. "Front and center, you will lead today's demonstration." A ripple of interest went through the formation. Leading the demonstration was typically an honor reserved for cadets who had distinguished themselves through exceptional performance. Elena had been competent, certainly, but hardly exceptional by coalition standards. Her selection was clearly deliberate, and not in a way that suggested good things for her immediate future. Elena stepped forward with the sort of calm acceptance that humans seem to exhibit when facing obviously unfavorable circumstances. No protest, no visible anxiety, just a slight adjustment of her stance that suggested she was preparing for something unpleasant. The Cubs watching from the sidelines leaned forward with obvious interest. "The Kepler conditioning protocol," Hextares announced with evident satisfaction. "Named after a particularly challenging training regimen developed by our biomechanical allies, designed to test the absolute limits of coalition military capability." The protocol was notorious among advanced cadets. It involved a series of increasingly demanding physical challenges that pushed even enhanced beings to their breaking points. Most species required specialized preparation and sometimes chemical assistance to complete it successfully. Hextares had never attempted it with a human subject before, but theoretical projections suggested spectacular failure within the first few phases. Elena nodded once, the gesture conveying nothing more than acknowledgement of received orders. If she was intimidated by the prospect of attempting something that regularly left crystallines cracked and nereids dehydrated, she showed no outward sign of concern. The first phase involved isometric holds that would have challenged a construction mech. Elena assumed the required position with textbook form, her body locked into a configuration that placed enormous stress on muscle groups humans had presumably never evolved to use extensively. The expected duration for most species was approximately 15 minutes before structural failure became unavoidable. Elena held the position, and held it, and continued holding it while Hextaris checked his chronometer with increasing frequency, and the assembled cadets began exchanging glances that suggested they were witnessing something outside normal parameters. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The human's breathing remained steady, her form perfect, her expression suggesting mild boredom rather than the expected agony. Sweat appeared on her forehead, certainly, but in quantities that seemed almost insulting given the circumstances. Boren, the crystalline cadet whose own species prided itself on structural integrity, was staring with the sort of fascination usually reserved for natural phenomena. His harmonic resonance had developed a slight tremor that suggested profound confusion about fundamental assumptions regarding biological limitations. "Phase 2, Hextaris announced, his voice carrying a note of irritation that suggested the morning was not proceeding according to plan. Phase 2 involved dynamic stress testing through a series of combat movements performed at maximum intensity while maintaining perfect form. It was designed to exhaust the cardiovascular systems of beings whose ancestors had evolved specifically for sustained physical performance." Elena transitioned into the sequence with the fluid efficiency of someone who had clearly spent considerable time studying the movements. What followed was a display that challenged several basic assumptions about human physiology. The movements required explosive power alternating with sustained control, testing multiple muscle groups in sequence while maintaining cognitive function under extreme duress. Elena performed each transition with mechanical precision, her breathing pattern adjusting automatically to optimize oxygen delivery. The cubs watching from the sidelines had given up any pretense of casual observation. Pip was practically vibrating with excitement, her mammalian tail twitching in a pattern that suggested she was mentally cataloging every technique. Bex had abandoned his usual coiled posture in favor of something resembling active attention, while Ori's gill slits were working overtime to process the implications of what they were witnessing. More concerning for Hextaris was the reaction of the formation itself. The other cadets were supposed to be maintaining regulation attention, but discipline was beginning to show stress fractures as they watched their human classmate demonstrate capabilities that did not align with their understanding of baseline human limitations. "Phase 3, Hextaris declared, his mandibles clicking with a sharp staccato that indicated significant annoyance. Phase 3 was where most cadets experienced what coalition training manuals euphemistically called performance degradation. It involved sustained high-intensity effort combined with complex cognitive tasks, designed to simulate combat conditions where physical exhaustion compromised decision-making ability. The failure rate among first-year cadets approached 90%. Elena nodded acknowledgement and proceeded to demonstrate why human evolution had apparently been working on some very specific problems for a very long time. The sequence required her to maintain maximum physical output while solving tactical problems that would have challenged fresh minds under optimal conditions. She moved through combat scenarios that demanded split-second timing while her body processed lactate buildup that should have compromised her neural function. Her responses to the tactical challenges remained sharp, her movement patterns adapted in real time to changing parameters, and her overall performance suggested that human biology operated according to principles that were not adequately represented in coalition physiological databases. 45 minutes into what was supposed to be a 15-minute humiliation, Elena showed no signs of the expected cascade failure that marked the limits of organic performance. Her technique remained crisp, her timing precise, and her expression suggested mild professional interest rather than the approaching exhaustion that should have been consuming her cognitive resources. The formation had given up any pretense of regulation attention. Senior cadets were openly staring, their own understanding of physical possibility undergoing rapid and uncomfortable revision. The cubs had moved closer, forming an impromptu semicircle that allowed them optimal viewing angles for what was rapidly becoming the most educational morning of their young military careers. Hextaris found himself in the unique position of watching his carefully planned demonstration transform into something resembling a recruitment video for human endurance capabilities. This was not the natural order reasserting itself. This was the natural order being politely but firmly informed that it might need to reconsider some of its basic assumptions. The human was still going. The morning had acquired that peculiar quality that occurs when reality decides to deviate from carefully laid plans. Instructor Hextaris clicked his mandibles in a rhythm that suggested profound recalculation of fundamental assumptions, while Elena continued her demonstration with the sort of steady persistence that had apparently served her species well during their improbable rise to interstellar status. What transformed the situation from mere embarrassment to genuine crisis was the behavior of the cubs. Pip had been the first to move. The small mammalian cadet had crept closer to the demonstration area, her natural curiosity overriding the considerable survival instincts that usually kept younger cadets at respectful distances from senior training exercises. Her species possessed enhanced pattern recognition capabilities, and she was clearly processing something that the older cadets had missed entirely. Elena's technique was not simply endurance through stubborn determination. She was employing systematic modifications to standard coalition forms, small adjustments that optimized energy expenditure while maintaining performance parameters. Her breathing patterns followed mathematical progressions that maximized oxygen efficiency. Her movement sequences incorporated recovery phases that were nearly invisible but apparently highly effective. She was not just surviving the Kepler protocol. She was demonstrating improvements to it. Bex had been the second to notice. His reptilian heritage included enhanced spatial processing abilities, and he was tracking the subtle shifts in Elena's posture that preceded each technique modification. Without conscious decision, he began mimicking her breathing pattern, his own physiology responding to the optimized rhythm in ways that felt surprisingly natural. "Cadet Pip," Hextaris called sharply, "return to observation position immediately." Pip ignored him completely, which represented a level of insubordination that would normally result in disciplinary action severe enough to serve as education for future generations. Instead, she had begun attempting to replicate Elena's stance modifications, her small frame adapting the human techniques with the sort of intuitive brilliance that characterized her species at their best. The result was immediate and obvious. Pip's normal performance envelope expanded dramatically as she incorporated Elena's efficiency improvements into her own movement patterns. Her endurance, already impressive for her size, began approaching levels that would have been remarkable for cadets twice her age. Echo noticed next. The sound-based species possessed auditory processing capabilities that allowed her to detect the micro-variations in Elena's muscle tension that preceded each technique shift. She began synchronizing her own movements to Elena's rhythm, her natural acoustic sensitivity translating human biomechanics into patterns she could replicate and refine. Within minutes, she was moving with a precision and efficiency that drew startled attention from the senior cadets. "What?" Boren asked, his crystalline structure resonating with confusion. "Are they doing?" What they were doing was learning. The cubs had instinctively recognized something that the older cadets' preconceptions had prevented them from seeing. Elena was not simply enduring the training protocol through primitive determination. She was demonstrating an approach to physical optimization that integrated techniques from multiple species into a coherent system that enhanced performance across biological boundaries. Ori joined the impromptu formation, her aquatic heritage allowing her to appreciate the fluid dynamics of Elena's movement transitions. Nox followed, his shadow-dwelling ancestry providing insights into the energy conservation principles that Elena was employing. Flux, with their shape-shifting capabilities, began experimenting with structural modifications that complemented Elena's techniques. The cubs were forming their own training group, using Elena as an informal instructor in methods that none of them had encountered in standard coalition curricula. Hextaris found himself facing a situation that military protocol had not adequately prepared him to handle. The morning's demonstration had been designed to establish hierarchical relationships through controlled failure. Instead, it was generating spontaneous tactical innovation among cadets who were supposed to be learning obedience, not initiative. "Cadet Elena," he called, mandibles clicking with the sharp authority that usually terminated unsanctioned activities immediately. "Halt demonstration, return to formation." Elena completed her current sequence with mathematical precision, then shifted smoothly into a recovery pattern that brought her heart rate and breathing back to baseline parameters with efficiency that would have impressed exercise physiologists from any species. She had just completed a training protocol that regularly hospitalized experienced cadets, and she appeared ready to continue indefinitely if required. "Yes, instructor," she replied, her tone conveying nothing more than professional acknowledgement of received orders. The Cubs, however, continued their experiments with Elena's techniques. Pip had achieved a movement efficiency that was drawing incredulous stares from the senior formation. Echo's acoustic sensitivity had allowed her to develop variations that enhanced the basic patterns for her own physiology. Ori was demonstrating fluid dynamics applications that suggested revolutionary possibilities for aquatic combat training. "Cubs," Hextaris commanded, "cease unauthorized activities and return to observation positions." Bex looked up from his attempt to integrate Elena's breathing patterns with his own reptilian respiratory system. "Instructor," he said with the sort of innocent curiosity that experienced educators learn to fear, "are these techniques included in standard training curricula?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. Standard coalition training had been developed over centuries of accumulated military wisdom, refined through practical application across countless conflict scenarios, and optimized for the physiological capabilities of member species. It represented the absolute pinnacle of interstellar military science, and a human cadet had just demonstrated modifications that appeared to enhance performance across multiple biological categories simultaneously. "Standard curricula," Hextaris replied with a careful precision that indicated he was buying time to formulate a response that would not require him to admit fundamental gaps in his understanding. "Represent tested methodologies appropriate for regulation training sequences. Flux, whose shape-shifting abilities allowed them to experiment with multiple biological configurations simultaneously, raised what might have been a hand. Instructor, should we incorporate these efficiency improvements into our standard practice routines?" The question was reasonable, logical, and absolutely catastrophic for Hextaris's carefully structured worldview. The morning's demonstration had been designed to prove human limitations. Instead, it was generating suggestions that coalition military training might benefit from human innovations. Elena stood at perfect attention, her expression suggesting mild professional interest in the educational discussion developing around her. She had not volunteered the techniques the Cubs were discovering. She had simply demonstrated standard human approaches to physical optimization, apparently unaware that such methods were not already integrated into coalition training protocols. The Cubs continued their experiments, their natural learning enthusiasm undeterred by the increasingly complex implications of their discoveries. Senior cadets were beginning to pay attention, their own performance metrics suggesting they might benefit from incorporating some of the techniques the younger cadets were developing. Instructor Korax, observing from the adjacent training area, had moved closer to monitor the situation. His avian heritage included enhanced pattern recognition, and he was clearly processing the tactical implications of what was developing in Hextaris's formation. The morning's carefully planned humiliation had transformed into an impromptu master class in innovative training methodology, taught by a human who apparently considered advanced coalition protocols to be interesting but improvable baseline techniques. Hextaris realized he had seriously miscalculated something fundamental about human capabilities. The aftermath of what would later be referred to in Academy records as the morning of uncomfortable revelations settled over the courtyard like cosmic dust after a particularly spectacular stellar collision. Instructor Hextaris stood amid the wreckage of his carefully constructed assumptions, watching his formation dissolve into something resembling organized chaos as Cubs demonstrated techniques that challenged centuries of military doctrine. Elena had returned to her position in the third rank with the sort of unassuming competence that humans seem to exhibit when they had accidentally revolutionized established systems. Her breathing had returned to normal. Her posture remained regulation perfect, and her expression suggested she was entirely unaware that she had just precipitated what amounted to a minor crisis in coalition training methodology. The Cubs, however, had discovered the sort of educational enthusiasm that experienced instructors usually tried to discourage. Pip was explaining movement efficiency principles to Bex while demonstrating modifications that had improved her performance parameters by measurable percentages. Echo was teaching Ori acoustic timing techniques that enhanced the aquatic cadet's natural fluid dynamics. Nox and Flux were collaborating on energy conservation methods that appeared to function across their radically different physiologies. They were, in essence, conducting their own training session based on principles they had observed during Elena's demonstration. The fact that these principles were apparently more effective than standard coalition methods was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Commander Helix had arrived to observe the situation, his biomechanical frame clicking with the sort of analytical precision that suggested he was processing data at computational speeds. As Academy head, he possessed access to performance metrics that painted a very clear picture of what was occurring in Hextaris's formation. "Instructor," Commander Helix observed, his voice carrying the particular tone that indicated significant recalculation of operational parameters, "the Cubs appear to have achieved performance improvements that exceed standard projections for their experience level." Hextaris clicked his mandibles in what might have been acknowledgement, or possibly profound irritation. The morning had begun with such promise. A simple demonstration of natural hierarchies, a gentle reminder of the proper order of things, a lesson in the importance of understanding one's limitations. Instead, he was witnessing what appeared to be spontaneous innovation in military training methodology, led by cadets who were barely old enough for basic instruction. "The human techniques," he admitted with the sort of reluctance usually reserved for admitting fundamental errors in navigation, "appear to possess certain efficiency characteristics that merit further analysis." Commander Helix's optical sensors focused on Elena with the intensity of advanced targeting systems. "Cadet Elena, report to my office after formation dismissal. Bring detailed documentation of the techniques you demonstrated this morning." Elena nodded once, her expression suggesting she was accustomed to being asked to explain things that seemed obvious to her but apparently confused everyone else. Humans, according to her file, had developed this particular social dynamic during their pre-spaceflight era, when their tendency to find solutions that worked better than established methods had frequently resulted in similar requests for documentation. The senior cadets were beginning to exhibit signs of what psychologists called cognitive dissonance. Boron's crystalline structure was resonating with frequencies that suggested profound confusion about fundamental assumptions. Nexia's fluid movements had acquired a certain stiffness that indicated she was reconsidering basic principles about optimal performance. The carefully maintained hierarchy that separated experienced cadets from newcomers was experiencing structural instability. Instructor Korax approached with the sort of professional curiosity that characterized effective educators when confronted with unexpected learning opportunities. His avian heritage included enhanced analytical capabilities, and he had been observing the Cubs' experiments with obvious interest. "Hextaris," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone that indicated he was about to suggest something that would require significant administrative flexibility. "Perhaps we should consider incorporating these techniques into our experimental training protocols." The suggestion was reasonable, logical, and represented exactly the sort of adaptive thinking that had made the Coalition successful in managing diverse species with radically different capabilities. It was also a complete reversal of the morning's intended lesson about human limitations and proper respect for established hierarchies. Elena continued to stand at attention, apparently oblivious to the minor revolution in military education that was developing around her. Her personnel file indicated that humans frequently exhibited this particular blind spot regarding their own innovations. They tended to assume that solutions which seemed obvious to them were equally obvious to everyone else, leading to confusion when other species required documentation and analysis to understand what humans accomplished through intuitive problem-solving. The cubs had formed what could only be described as an informal study group, comparing notes on technique modifications and discussing applications for their various physiologies. Their natural learning enthusiasm had been amplified by the discovery that they could achieve performance levels that exceeded their theoretical capabilities through methods that were not included in standard curricula. Pip had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of the group, her mammalian social instincts adapting naturally to the role of organizing collaborative learning. "Elena," she called, ignoring the fact that speaking directly to senior cadets without invitation represented a violation of protocol that would normally result in disciplinary action. "Can you show us the breathing pattern you used during the endurance phase?" Elena glanced at Hextaris for permission, her expression suggesting she was familiar with military hierarchy, even if she occasionally challenged its underlying assumptions. When the instructor nodded with obvious reluctance, she demonstrated the respiratory technique that had allowed her to maintain performance throughout the extended protocol. The cubs immediately began experimenting with adaptations for their own physiologies, their natural scientific curiosity overriding any concern about the implications of discovering that human methods might be superior to established coalition techniques. Commander Helix observed the proceedings with a sort of analytical attention that suggested he was already drafting reports that would require careful explanation to higher authorities. The morning's events represented exactly the sort of spontaneous innovation that made the coalition effective in managing diverse challenges. But they also challenged fundamental assumptions about training methodologies that had been developed over centuries of accumulated experience. The irony was not lost on Hextaris as he watched Elena return to formation while the cubs continued their enthusiastic exploration of her techniques. He had intended to demonstrate human limitations through controlled failure. Instead, he had accidentally provided evidence that human approaches to problem-solving might enhance coalition military effectiveness in ways that had not been previously considered. Elena stood among her classmates with the sort of modest competence that suggested she was entirely unaware of the minor crisis in military education that her morning demonstration had precipitated. The cubs continued their experiments, their performance improvements providing quantifiable evidence that human innovations might deserve serious consideration in coalition training protocols. The morning sun reached its zenith over the academy, illuminating a scene that perfectly captured the essential unpredictability of interspecies cooperation. Hextaris had attempted to shame the human through superior alien discipline, only to discover that the cubs found her methods worthy of emulation rather than mockery. Sometimes, he reflected with the sort of philosophical resignation that comes with having one's worldview thoroughly recalibrated, the galaxy possessed an inconvenient sense of humor about the proper order of things.